Ambassadors both, thank you so much for joining us today. We're hoping to have a discussion about the security issues facing the region and the world over the coming year. So if I could, I'd like to start by asking you what you see as the single greatest security issue for 2019.
Well, Isabel, before I respond to that question, which I'm happy to do, I'd first like to thank you and Bloomberg and all of your subscribers for having me here today. I'd also like to take just a moment to recognize someone very important to the United States, someone very important to me, and that's President George H.W. Bush, who recently passed away. Back in the United States, it's a day of mourning. Yesterday, we held the day of mourning here. I was very fortunate to have served President George H.W. Bush. As Minister Motegi mentioned earlier, when he was at McKinsey, I was at Boston Consulting Group here in Tokyo. I left just after the Persian Gulf War to go work on President Bush's staff then. It was a privilege to serve him then. It was a great honor to know someone who is such a statesman and a real gentleman. So my heart goes out to his family and to America, who is mourning today. Also, I'd like to say that my prayers are with a rescue operation that's underway right now, just off the coast of Japan. Last night, we had an incident with an in-air refueling operation, and we have 2 planes down in the sea. My heart goes out to the Marines and their families who we're looking for right now. My appreciation goes out to the Japan Self-Defense Force that is working hand in hand with the United States on the rescue operation. It's a very tightly integrated operation, and we're working very hard to locate our missing Marines right now. So my prayers are with them as well. Thank you. Now to the question, the greatest security threat. In my mind, the most immediate threat in the region is and remains North Korea. It's interesting, looking forward, North Korea has a unique opportunity. Kim Jong-un has a unique opportunity in 2019 to change his destiny, to create a new path for peace and prosperity. It's certainly our goal to see that happen, and we're working arm in arm with Japan and our other allies to see that that's so.
Right. Could I ask Ambassador Fujisaki, how do you see the greatest issue for next year?
Isabel-san, thank you very much for having me. And you said both ambassadors, but there's a great difference between incumbent ambassador and former ambassador. Incumbent ambassadors are called ambassador because of respect. Former ambassadors are called ambassadors because they forgot our names. By the way, I'm very sorry for the passing of President H.W. Bush, and I visited him twice in Kennebunkport Port, and really he was the ideal statesman, really a decent, very sort of first-rate statesman, I thought. As for those Marine pilots missing, I'm joining him in praying for the safety.
Thank you.
Because they've been working hard for us to secure the place. As for your question, now, I'm worried about Middle East because of Iran situation now with the United States and also Saudi Arabia's unstableness. And I hope that because other areas, it's sort of taken care of, but it's sort of disarray in Middle East. Now, as for North Korea, Ambassador Hagerty has spoken. We are in a lot better situation than 6 months ago, thanks to President Trump's effort. However, what is important is where we go from here. I hope there will be no rush, because now they are on the demander side. They would like to have us lift the sanctions. They may say something about papers, but the real intention is sanctions. We should be very careful not to make easy deal if they have not really taken steps towards denuclearization.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Obviously, President Trump has in recent days mentioned again that we could be seeing another summit early next year. What do you feel has been achieved by having the first summit, and how far further could a second summit take us, do you think?
Well, at the first summit, both Chairman Kim and President Trump agreed in principle on the goal of denuclearization. I think that's a positive step, but to put it in context, what got us to that summit? And if I think back a little more than a year ago, there were rockets overflying Hokkaido. Nuclear bomb tests going on in North Korea. School children here in central Tokyo were wearing hard hats and conducting evacuation drills. Since that time, the maximum pressure campaign that President Trump, along lockstep with Prime Minister Abe in Japan and our other allies, has created a fundamentally different environment. No more missiles, no more bomb tests. The apprehension of the children here in Tokyo is not the same. We've had abductees returned from North Korea to America. So I think we're in a fundamentally different place right now. Since the summit, we've seen the return of Americans' remains that were lost during the Korean War. We've seen disassembly of some nuclear testing facilities in North Korea. Are we where we want to be? No. But we're in a fundamentally different place. I agree with you, Ambassador. We're in a fundamentally different place today than we were. So I'm optimistic that the team that President Trump has put in place could be no better. I'm friends with both Secretary Pompeo and with our Special Envoy, Steve Biegun. These are two extremely competent individuals, and they're moving in a very orderly fashion and in lockstep with our allies to create the environment for President Trump and Chairman Kim to re-engage and continue to move the ball forward. And I also agree with you, Ambassador Fujisaki, that we shouldn't work in haste. We should work in a very deliberate manner to achieve our goal. And to be clear, our goal has never changed. Our goal has never changed. That's the complete and verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. And the sanctions that we work so effectively to put in place remain intact. So I think the environment moving into 2019 is one that, again, presents an opportunity for Kim Jong-un to see a different path. And I hope that he'll take that path in a way that's good for the North Korean people and good for the world writ large.
Right. Ambassador Fujisaki, obviously, perhaps we feel safer in Tokyo now that we're not seeing these missile tests over our heads. But do you think a second summit could be helpful in nudging North Korea towards abandoning its arsenal?
Well, it depends on the preparation and content. Of course, if there's a good enough preparation as led by Secretary Pompeo, and if you could produce results, I think there should be a summit. But of course, as Ambassador have suggested, it's not for the summit for the sake of summit. But I think but the present situation is de facto moratorium. They cannot fire missiles. They cannot make nuclear tests anymore now. And they're just wanting us to lift the sanctions. So we have to really push them so that they can produce some results to us. And then I think there'll be, if there's that hint coming from them, I think we should have summit.
Right. If I could move on now to the topic of China. We have a question for the audience here. If you'd like to pull out your app again. The question is, how do you see the trade friction between the US and China developing next year? Do you think it will get worse, improve, or perhaps remain about the levels we see now? So we'll leave that to stew while we talk.
Underway. There we go.
Obviously, President Trump and his administration have taken a pretty hard line on China, on trade. Do you think this is the most effective way to maintain relations with China and also to get good results at the same time on the trade balance?
I think we're moving in the only direction possible. The answer in my mind is quite simple. China needs to change their behavior. I was just with Secretary Mattis this past weekend, and he reiterated our posture, and that is that we're looking for cooperation with China where we can, but we will confront China when we must. China is a significant participant in the global economy. I think it's time that they acknowledge their role and participate as a responsible player. That means no more forced technology transfer. That means respect for intellectual property rights. That means addressing subsidies in a way that leads us to a fair and reciprocal environment for trade for all. That's the President's goal. We're moving in that direction, and I think the pressure that he's putting on the situation is underscoring the necessity for China to change its behavior.
Obviously, in the meantime, while the negotiations are ongoing and the sanctions are in place, there is a risk of damage to the global economy. But there's also potentially a risk, I think. Before the Trump administration, we saw much more of an emphasis on issues like the South China Sea. Ambassador Fujisaki, are you concerned that those issues could be left by the wayside while we're focusing on trade?
I think South China Sea issue or intellectual property issue or other issues have not been sufficiently addressed. And I think it's important that the United States should take a firm stance on those issues. And I think this is for the first time that China is really showing some steps in trade areas. I hope they'll show some signs in South China Sea as well. And in the end, but in Asia, East Asia especially, face is important. So China, I think you have to be thinking about the face saving of China. I think they have to take voluntary steps as well, not be told by them. But in the end, I am, as Minister Motegi has said, cautiously optimistic that somehow China would come around as well. And the U.S., I think, needs to mind about its own economy as well, and world economy. So I don't think it's going to go the doomsday scenario as some journalists may like to paint on.
But how do the two of you see relations going forward? There's been a more confrontational tone in some ways. Although President Trump does seem to have something of a good relationship with President Xi, could this develop into something like a Cold War between the US and China?
I do not see a Cold War myself. I see a situation that has gotten to a point that it must be addressed. If you look at the individual companies, I've been an investor in China. I've been on boards of directors of companies with major operations in China. Our companies have been forced to put their servers behind the Great Firewall of China. The stories are many, and the behavior is unacceptable. It's time for a change. And again, I don't see the answer as being as complicated as it seems to be contemplated in the media. China needs to accept the fact that they've been a major beneficiary of this global economy, and they need to take a responsible role as a participant in the global economy. And in doing so, that means they must address issues like forced technology transfer and respect intellectual property and create a more level and fair playing field. With that, I think we'll find ourselves in a much better position. The United States and China will both be in a better place. Japan and our other allies will be in a place once that result is achieved. At the G20, President Trump and Xi met and agreed to a 90-day stall on the further increase of tariffs. I hope that leads us to a better place. Certainly the words have been encouraging from China, but what we need to see is hard and concrete action. That's what we're looking for, and I hope that's what we'll see.
As for the world, a new Cold War, I think people like to create those easy labeling, but the situation with Russia and China today is so different. One, there was about the same amount of nuclear arsenals between Russia and the United States, about 7,000. And so there was a mutually assured destruction theory. Second, Russia was not economically intertwined with world or United States. Now it's really intertwined, so it's a totally different. And also, China is a sort of upward country where Russia was a declining industry, so it has to be sort of cold. And it's a totally different situation. So I don't really look at it as a Cold War situation. I think because China has to move as well.
Right. Well, if I could move along now to the issue of US-Japan trade, which has already been covered to some extent by Mr. Motegi, but if I could just get your views. Both sides tend to talk, well, perhaps more the Japanese side tends to talk about a win-win deal from these negotiations. But from the outside, it looks as though America is asking for more access to Japan And there doesn't seem all that much that Japan might get in return. Now, how can this be made into a win-win deal? What's in it for Japan this time?
Well, at the very outset, it's quite clear to me that it's time to bring our trading relationship with Japan in line with what is the strongest security, diplomatic, and people-to-people relationship in the world. It's time to do that. And I'm optimistic that we'll find a path to do that in a way that is a win-win situation. Minister Motegi mentioned several points during his talk. Automotive is one of the sectors that, if you look at the trade deficit, you realize immediately that automotive is the primary component of the trade deficit with Japan. Minister Motegi mentioned the statistics, but there is a dramatically larger volume of automotive and parts production here in Japan than is consumed here in Japan. What happens? Japan exports that to countries like the United States. In doing so, Japan takes on far more currency risk, in my mind, than is necessary. They're incurring all of their cost structure in yen and setting their prices very typically on an annual basis in dollars and selling into our market. We've worked very hard to make the story in the United States a positive one that's conducive to capital investment. If you look at what's happened over the past year and a half, 2 years, we've had significant progress in terms of streamlining regulations. We've made it a much more favorable business climate. Tax reform has had a significant impact on the return on capital for companies that are contemplating investing in America. We've taken what was the highest corporate tax rate in the world to a level that's far more competitive. The result is we have now consumer and business confidence at all-time highs. We have an economy now that's growing at greater than 3% GDP growth rate per annum. We have a great story in the United States, and I think companies in Japan will continue to see that. Now that the trade agreement is in place with Canada and Mexico, I think that will help sort out the supply chain math that companies need to do. My goal is to see more cross-border capital flow, not only coming from Japan, but also to see more capital flow from America into Japan. Today, America is by far the largest direct investor in Japan. And Motegi-san mentioned the job creation that is significant in America from Japanese capital, but American companies create tens of thousands of jobs here in Japan. I'd like to see that increase, and I see the entrepreneurial spirit here in Japan coming back to life. When I lived here before, Japan was an amazing hotbed of innovation. That was the late 1980s, 1990. Companies and leaders were coming here from all over the world. When I was at Boston Consulting Group, we would take them to Akihabara to see the latest in technology. If you wanted to see a high-definition television, there was one place in the world you could see that. That was Ginza, right here. The innovation spirit is here. The DNA is here. But Japan went through a very challenging couple of decades. And what happens when you have a tough economy? You cut back on R&D, and a cost-cutting mentality takes hold. And I think that the leadership in Japan has been so focused on cost-cutting that it's been a challenge to move back into an investment mode and begin to grow again. But I have a real sense of optimism about Japan as well. And you can tell I'm optimistic about the United States. But Japan has now had 2 years of consecutive positive growth. And when I talk to younger leaders here, I see a real appetite to innovate here in Japan and, frankly, to partner with American capital and with American innovation and bring that to bear on an economy that's got significant challenges, whether it's demographic challenges, regional challenges, or shared opportunities as we look at growing in this entire region. Because the Indo-Pacific region presents great opportunity for the U.S. and Japan, and our goal is to work in lockstep to find that opportunity together. So I have great reason for optimism, and I think that two gentlemen, Ambassador Lighthizer and Minister Motegi, I'm friends with both of them. They're both very bright. I think they will come to a win-win agreement for both of our nations that we'll all be proud of.
So if I could ask Ambassador Fujisaki.
I think the best scenario for Japan, ideal scenario, is that U.S. would come back one day to TPP. I think still many Japanese believe that Japan, the United States, should be part of the whole picture of Asia-Pacific Institute. But for the moment, I think, as Prime Minister Abe President Trump has agreed on September 26 last year to start this negotiations on trade and goods. I am certain that the Japanese government will live up to that and try to conclude agreement as soon as possible. And as Mr. Motegi has mentioned, any trade deal is very difficult to strike. I've been in some of the negotiations. All the negotiations you would have to negotiate beyond the clock and will go and go and go, and in the very last moment they'll come to some agreement. But we never have failed to reach agreement between the United States and Japan, and I think we will again do that. One thing that is important is that as for TPP or Paris Accord, that was not there. So even the United States, if they didn't join it, I think we can go ahead and do other things. And but as for the existing structure, that is a pillar of our society, which is United Nations, WTO, IMF, and all that. It has become rusted after many years, but we cannot do away with it. Because if we lose those pillars, it's going to be a chaos. So we have to improve the system. The leading countries, United States, Japan, and others, should really make a really astute discussion to try to improve this infrastructure. And up until that, we have to respect. Up until we come to agreement, we have to respect the present organizations. Right. That's very important.
Right.
Just one point I might add on this. Regarding the TPP, I think that the President and Prime Minister Abe have made a wise decision to move forward in an area that's pragmatic and practical. The TPP lost political support in Japan, in the United States, in the year 2016. President Obama didn't bring it to the U.S. Senate for one simple reason: it wouldn't pass. We need to accept the political reality that we're living in, and we need to move forward, as I said, to create a trade agreement with Japan that's commensurate with the most important and strong security, diplomatic, and people-to-people relationship in the world. And I'm very optimistic that Ambassador Lighthizer and Motegi-san will come together and create a comprehensive agreement on goods, on services, on investment, and on trade that will yield a win-win for all of us. I also think that moving forward, the fact that Japan, the EU, and the United States agreed to come together at the last UN General Assembly meeting and work in concert to reform the WTO in ways that address the non-market behaviors of third countries like China that insist on intellectual property reform, that insist on stopping forced technology transfer, and insisting on new rules that will address the economy of today. I think that's a very positive step forward, and I think it's very consistent with Ambassador Fujisaki's position that we should take these somewhat rusted structures and try to update and improve them. And I'm very encouraged that Japan, Europe, and the United States are working together in this fashion.
I agree that we have we're not asking the United States now to come back to TPP because, as you said, the situation has moved. But one day, if U.S. says that I want to come back, we should be open and we should be welcoming the United States. That's what I said. I know that it will not happen.
Okay, well, thank you both so much, both ambassadors. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we'll have to leave it there, even though there's so many other things I'd like to ask you. But thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much for having us.